The air in the university's oldest building always smelled the same, a mix of old paper, floor polish, and the faint, sharp scent of chalk dust that never quite went away. For Anjali, it was the smell of possibility. She clutched the strap of her worn backpack, the fabric frayed in a way that spoke of countless high school assignments, and now, her first year at this huge, intimidating place. Her heart was doing a funny little dance against her ribs, a mix of pure excitement and a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the stale coffee she'd gulped down for breakfast. This was it. Calculus 3, the class everyone in the engineering department whispered about, a legendary filter course that separated the future builders of bridges and rockets from those who would, perhaps, find a different path. She found the lecture hall and pushed through a heavy wooden door, the sound swallowed immediately by the sheer size of the room. It was a giant, sloped amphitheater with rows of dark wooden seats that seemed to climb all the way to the ceiling. A massive green chalkboard dominated the front wall, so clean it looked like it had never been used. Anjali felt very small. She slid into a seat about a third of the way from the front, close enough to see the board but far enough back to feel like she wasn't putting herself on display. She pulled out a brand-new 5-subject notebook, the plastic cover still crisp, and a handful of sharpened pencils. These were her tools, her weapons. She was ready. Looking around, she felt the first prickle of doubt. The hall was filling up, and the other students didn't look nervous. They looked comfortable. A group of guys in the front row were already laughing, talking about some coding competition. A girl nearby was typing furiously on a sleek laptop that probably cost more than Anjali's first car. They all seemed to speak a language she was still learning. A world of summer internships at tech companies and parents who were doctors and engineers. Anjali's world was different. Her dad was a car mechanic, his hands permanently stained with grease, a man who could understand the intricate dance of an engine just by listening to it. Her mom was a nurse whose idea of a complex problem was juggling 3 double shifts in a row. They were brilliant, practical people, and they had sacrificed so much for her to be here. The thought of letting them down was a heavy weight in her stomach. She took a deep breath, the smell of chalk dust filling her lungs again. Asterisk, you earned your spot here, asterisk, she told herself, the words a mantra she'd been repeating all morning. Asterisk, your grades got you in. You belong here just as much as anyone else. Asterisk, she uncapped her pen, the small click a satisfying, definite sound in the growing hum of the room. Then the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle, like a change in air pressure. The low chatter died down, heads turned, and a path seemed to clear near the aisle. A man walked in, and he carried himself like he owned not just the room, but the very concept of mathematics itself. He was probably in his late 50s, with silver hair cut short and a face that seemed set in a permanent expression of intellectual superiority. He wore a tweed jacket, even though it wasn't cold, and his glasses were perched precisely on the end of his nose. He didn't look at anyone as he made his way to the front, placing his briefcase on the lectern with a quiet, deliberate thud. This was him, Dr. Davies, the professor whose name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. He finally looked up, and his eyes swept across the room. They were sharp, analytical eyes, the kind that didn't just see you, but seemed to categorize and assess you in a split second. Anjali felt her breath catch. When his gaze passed over her, it felt different. It wasn't a quick glance. It paused. For a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowed slightly, as if he'd found something puzzling or out of place. Maybe it was her. Simple jeans and t-shirt, or the worn backpack at her feet, or the hopeful, slightly scared look on her face that she couldn't quite hide. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a movement so small she might have imagined it, before his eyes moved on to the next student and the next. But the feeling lingered. It was a cold, sharp little dart of dismissal, and it landed right in the center of her chest. She felt her face get hot. Dr. Davies tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the now silent hall. "Welcome," he began, his voice crisp and devoid of any warmth. "This is Calculus 3. For many of you, this will be the most difficult course you will take as an undergraduate. I will not waste your time with pleasantries. My purpose here is not to be your friend. My purpose is to teach you multivariable calculus, and in doing so, to separate those with a true aptitude for this field from those who are merely persistent." He let that hang in the air. Anjali felt her pen grip tighten. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Some people believe that with enough hard work, anyone can learn anything," he continued, pacing slowly in front of the chalkboard. "I do not share that sentiment. Higher mathematics is not a skill to be learned like carpentry. It is a language, a way of seeing the world that you are either born with or you are not. This course is designed to be a filter. It is designed to weed out those who do not have the innate gift for abstract thought. It is better for you to discover this now, in this classroom, than after 5 years of pursuing a career for which you are fundamentally unsuited." The words were like stones dropped one by one into the quiet room. Fundamentally unsuited. Anjali's stomach churned. She thought of her dad, who could solve problems with his hands that no textbook could ever teach him. She thought of the long nights she had spent in her bedroom, not just studying, but truly loving the way numbers fit together, the elegant logic of a proof that worked out perfectly. Was that all just persistence? Was she just fooling herself? She looked around again. The students in the front row didn't look bothered. They looked challenged, like this was exactly what they expected, a test they were eager to pass. They were the ones with the gift, she thought. The ones Dr. Davies was talking to, and then there was her. The girl from the other side of town with her worn backpack and her hopeful heart. The girl he had looked at with that flicker of dismissal. He had already decided. He had looked at her, and in that single glance he had put her in a box. The persistent but not gifted box. A strange feeling started to bubble up inside her, pushing past the hurt and the doubt. It was hot and sharp. It was anger. It was the same feeling she'd get when someone at a part-time job assumed she couldn't lift something heavy, or when a counselor in high school had gently suggested she consider a less demanding major. It was the fury of being underestimated, her jaw set. The nervousness was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, something hard and unyielding. She wasn't here to be filtered out. She wasn't here to be a cautionary tale in some professor's grand speech about innate gifts. She was here because she loved to solve problems, and she was good at it. Dr. Davies picked up a piece of chalk. "Let us begin," he said, his back to the room. He started writing equations on the board, the chalk scratching against the surface in a steady rhythm. But Anjali wasn't really looking at the board. She was looking at the back of his head, and she was making a silent promise to herself. She opened her crisp new notebook to the first page. She didn't write down the date or the course title. She just wrote one word, underlining it twice: watch. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was both comforting and crushing. The comforting part was the routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Anjali would find her seat in the massive lecture hall, her worn notebook open, her pencils lined up like soldiers ready for battle. She would listen, her pen flying across the page, capturing every equation, every theorem, every word that fell from Dr. Davies' lips. His lectures, she had to admit, were brilliant. He didn't just teach calculus. He painted pictures with it, describing the shape of the universe in numbers and symbols. He made the abstract feel tangible, and in those moments, Anjali felt a spark of the pure joy that had drawn her to math in the first place. But the crushing part was always right around the corner. Dr. Davies had his favorites. They were the students who sat in the first 2 rows, the ones who never seemed to take notes because they already understood everything. They were the ones who would ask questions that weren't really questions at all, but rather complex observations designed to show off how much they knew. Dr. Davies would indulge them, a rare, thin smile gracing his lips. He would engage them in a rapid-fire dialogue. A private club meeting happening right in front of everyone else. Anjali was not in the club. One afternoon, he was explaining a particularly tricky concept about flux integrals. Anjali had been following along, but there was one small step in his derivation that she just couldn't see. It felt like he had skipped a line of logic. She raised her hand, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. For a moment she thought he wouldn't see her. But he did. He stopped talking and the entire room fell silent. His eyes found hers. "Yes?" he said, his voice flat. "Professor," she began, her voice a little shaky. "I was just wondering on that third step, how you got from the vector field to the divergence. I think I'm missing the connection there." A few of the students in the front row snickered quietly. Dr. Davies didn't join them, but his expression was worse. It was a look of profound disappointment, as if she had just asked why the sky was blue. "The connection is explained in the required reading," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Chapter 4, Section 2. "Perhaps you would be better served by reviewing the foundational material before interrupting the lecture with rudimentary questions." Her face burned with a heat so intense she was sure everyone could see it. She quickly lowered her hand and stared at her notebook, the neat equations blurring through a film of humiliation. She had read Chapter 4, Section 2, twice. It was the application that was confusing her. His answer wasn't helpful. It was a public reprimand. It was a clear message: your questions are not welcome here. Your confusion is a sign of your inadequacy. After that, she stopped raising her hand. Her world began to shrink to the size of a library carrel. The university library was a massive, beautiful building, a cathedral of silence and the smell of aging paper. Anjali found a small desk in the deepest corner of the math stacks, a place where no one ever went. It became her sanctuary and her prison. She spent hours there, long after the sun went down, surrounded by towering shelves of books that held secrets she was determined to unlock. She worked through every problem in the textbook, not just the assigned ones. She found other textbooks, older ones with different explanations, and worked through those problems, too. She was often alone. Sometimes she would see other students from her class in groups, huddled around a whiteboard, arguing good-naturedly about a solution. They seemed to be enjoying the struggle, turning it into a social event. Anjali's struggle was a solitary one. She had a lab partner in her physics course, a quiet boy named Rohan who was also an engineering student. They sometimes studied together, but their friendship was new and tentative, built more on shared silence than on deep conversation. He was smart, but he was just as overwhelmed as she was, and their study sessions often turned into two people staring at the same impossible problem. Lost in their own separate worlds of frustration, the first major exam for Calculus 3 loomed on the horizon like a storm cloud. Anjali felt a strange mix of terror and readiness. She had done the work. She had put in the hours. Her notebook was a dense forest of numbers and graphs, a testament to her effort. The night before the exam, she barely slept. She lay in her narrow dorm bed, the cheap blanket pulled up to her chin, replaying equations in her head. She could feel her dad's calloused hand on her shoulder, an imaginary gesture of comfort from 1,000 miles away. "You can do this," he would say. "Just take it one piece at a time." The day of the exam, the lecture hall was tense. The only sound was the rustling of paper and the squeak of pens. Dr. Davies handed out the papers, his movements sharp and efficient. "You have 90 minutes, he announced. "Begin." Anjali took a deep breath and looked at the first problem. It was hard, but she knew how to start. She moved to the second, then the third. She fell into a rhythm, her mind clear and focused. She didn't think about Dr. Davies or the other students. It was just her and the problems. She used her own methodical, step-by-step approach, carefully checking her work, making sure every tiny detail was perfect. She wasn't looking for intuitive elegance. She was looking for the right answer. When the time was up, her hand was aching, but she felt a quiet sense of pride. She had done her best. A week later, the graded exams were handed back at the end of class. Anjali's heart was pounding as she made her way to the front. Dr. Davies didn't look at her, just placed the paper face down on the stack in her outstretched hand. She walked back to her seat, her legs feeling like lead. She took another deep breath and turned the paper over. At the top, circled in red, it wasn't a failing grade. It was a perfectly respectable grade, one that most students would be happy with. But for Anjali, it felt like a punch to the gut. All those hours, all that work, all that sacrifice, for a B. She felt the sting of tears behind her eyes and blinked them back angrily. Then she saw it. Scrawled in his familiar, spiky handwriting just below the grade was a single, devastating comment. Technically correct, but lacks the intuitive elegance of a true mathematician. The words hit her like a physical blow. Technically correct. Lacks elegance. It was the most personal, most cutting insult he could have given her. He wasn't grading her work. He was grading her soul. He was telling her that she could work as hard as she wanted. She could get all the answers right, but she would never truly get it. She would never be one of them. She was just a mechanic tightening the bolts. But she would never understand the poetry of the engine. She walked out of the lecture hall in a daze, the exam paper clutched in her hand. The noise of the campus, the chatter of students, the chirping of birds, it all faded into a dull hum. All she could hear was Dr. Davies' voice in her head, repeating his first-day speech. Fundamentally unsuited. She went back to her small, plain dorm room and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. The B and the comment were a paper cut to the soul, but they had also let all the doubt and insecurity she had been holding back come flooding in. Was he right? Maybe she was just persistent. Maybe she was just good at following instructions. Maybe she had been fooling herself this whole time, thinking she could compete in a world where she didn't belong. She thought about her academic advisor's gentle suggestion to drop the class if it was too much. For the first time, it didn't sound like a suggestion. It sounded like a command. A sensible, logical command. She pulled out her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, ready to look up the deadline to withdraw from a course, but then she stopped. Her eyes fell on the exam paper lying on her desk. Technically correct. He hadn't said she was wrong. He had said her way of doing it wasn't beautiful enough. She thought of her father, standing under the hood of a beat-up car, his hands covered in grease. He didn't fix engines with elegant solutions. He used wrenches and brute force and a deep, practical knowledge of how things worked. He found the problem, and he fixed it. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. It got people back on the road. A quiet fire began to bank in her stomach, pushing back the cold wave of despair. Dr. Davies had a very narrow, very arrogant definition of what it meant to be good at math. He wanted poets. She was a mechanic. And maybe, just maybe, the world needed mechanics more than it needed poets. She closed the laptop, the decision made. She wasn't dropping the class. She was done trying to impress him. She was done trying to find the elegant solution. She was going to learn this material for herself, in her own way, on her own terms. And she was going to master it. The anger she had felt on that first day returned, but it was no longer a hot, messy flash. It was now a cold, hard-focused flame, a fuel source. She picked up her pencil and opened her notebook to a fresh page. It was time to get back to work. The days after the exam settled into a new kind of quiet for Anjali. The desperate need to prove herself to Dr. Davies had vanished, replaced by a calm, steady focus. She still went to every lecture, still sat in the same seat, still took meticulous notes. But the dynamic had shifted. She was no longer a participant in his high-stakes performance. She was an observer, a scientist studying a strange and arrogant specimen. She was there to learn the math and nothing more. His comments, his dismissals, his clear favoritism, they all seemed to happen to someone else, on the other side of a thick glass wall. Her world had shrunk to the pages of her notebook and the quiet solitude of her library carrel. She was learning for herself, and in that, she found a freedom she hadn't felt since she first arrived on campus, one Tuesday. The lecture was on vector fields, a topic Anjali found fascinating. Dr. Davies was in top form, his chalk flying across the board, sketching elaborate diagrams of swirling air currents and magnetic fields. He was describing the flow of a fluid around an object, and his passion was undeniable. For a moment, Anjali forgot her resentment and was simply captivated by the beauty of the concepts he was explaining. He made the invisible world of forces and currents visible, tangible. Then as the lecture was winding down, he paused. A different kind of energy entered the room. "What we've discussed today," he said, his voice lower, more intimate, Is child's play compared to the true frontiers of mathematics? It's the application of rules that were established centuries ago. He walked over to the side of the chalkboard to an area he hadn't used. There are problems out there that don't play by the rules. Problems that force you to question the very nature of space and dimension. He began to write, not the neat, orderly equations from the lecture, but a wild, complex set of symbols and expressions. This is a simplified version of what is known as the Kovalevsky paradox, he announced. A problem that stumped the greatest minds for over a generation. It deals with the behavior of a surface in a non-Euclidean space, a space where the parallel lines you learned about in high school can, in fact, meet. The official solution is hundreds of pages long, a monster of pure abstract algebra that only a handful of people on this planet can truly claim to understand. He stepped back, admiring the chaotic beauty of the equation on the board. "It's a curiosity," he said, turning back to the class. A small, cynical smile played on his lips. A perfect illustration of why most of you should focus on engineering applications rather than pure theory. The structure of this paradox is counterintuitive. It resists standard methods. It is, for all intents and purposes, a waste of your time. He picked up an eraser. "Don't waste your time," he repeated, and with a few swift swipes the complex problem was gone, leaving only a cloud of white dust and a faint ghost of chalk on the blackboard. The bell rang and he packed his briefcase, leaving the students in a stunned silence. Angeli didn't move. The other students filed out, their chatter already turning to their next class. But Angeli was still staring at the empty space on the board. "Don't waste your time." The words echoed in her mind. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. A gatekeeper closing a gate? He had decided this knowledge was not for them. It was for people like him, the true mathematicians. And in that moment, a switch inside her flipped. She had been content to ignore him, to learn on her own. But now he had actively challenged her. He had drawn a line in the sand and told her she did not dare cross it. That night she didn't go to the library. She went back to her dorm room, a small, plain space with a desk, a bed, and a window that looked out onto the brick wall of the next building. She sat down with a fresh piece of paper and a cup of instant coffee, the steam fogging up her glasses. She closed her eyes and tried to recreate the equation from the board. It was fuzzy, but the core structure was there. It wasn't just a string of numbers. It had a shape, a strange, twisted shape in her mind's eye. Hours passed. The coffee went cold. She tried to solve it the proper way, the way she knew Dr. Davies would expect. She pulled out her advanced textbooks, flipping through chapters on abstract algebra and differential geometry. It was like trying to read a foreign language with a dictionary that was missing half the words. Every path led to a dead end, a wall of impenetrable symbols. She felt the old frustration creeping back, the feeling of being an imposter. She pushed her chair back and stood up, pacing the small room. She was about to give up, to crumple up the papers and accept that he was right, but then she stopped. She looked at the mess of sketches on her desk. They weren't equations. They were shapes. She had been drawing, trying to visualize the problem. She thought about what Dr. Davies had said, non-Euclidean space. She thought about her engineering graphics class, about how they took complex 3D objects and represented them with simple 2D drawings. They used top, front, and side views. What if this paradox wasn't a single, monstrous 3D shape in a weird space? What if it was a simple shape viewed from a strange angle? A new idea began to form, a spark in the darkness. She sat back down, but this time she didn't reach for a textbook. She grabbed her colored pencils. She started drawing, not equations, but a simple cube. Then she started to fold it, not in her mind, but on paper. She drew lines of stress, lines of force, just like she'd learned in her statics class. She thought about how a piece of metal would bend, how a fluid would flow around a corner. The problem wasn't about abstract symbols. It was about a physical object behaving in a physical way. Even if that physical way existed in a theoretical space, the night wore on. The world outside her window went from black to a deep, dark blue. Her hand ached from drawing, her eyes burned from lack of sleep. But she was no longer frustrated. She was in a state of flow, a place where time and self seemed to disappear. She wasn't thinking about Dr. Davies or the exam or her grade. She was just a person with a pencil and a piece of paper wrestling with a beautiful, intricate puzzle. She wasn't using the heavy, cumbersome tools of a true mathematician. She was using her own tools: visualization, spatial reasoning, a practical understanding of how things fit together. She was a mechanic, and she was taking the engine apart to see how it worked. As the first pale light of dawn began to seep through her window, it happened. All the separate sketches, all the different angles and lines suddenly clicked into place. She saw it. It wasn't a monster. It was a flower, a complex, multi-layered shape that, when viewed from the right perspective, unfolded with a simple, devastating elegance. The solution wasn't a long, ugly calculation. It was a single, breathtakingly simple proof that could be drawn on a napkin. It was so simple, so obvious, she couldn't believe no one had seen it before. Or maybe they had been too blinded by the complex, elegant theories to see the simple truth right in front of them. She leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. She was exhausted, her body felt heavy as lead, but her mind was buzzing, sharp and clear. She picked up a fresh sheet of paper and, with a steady hand, began to write. She didn't just write the solution. She drew it. She explained it step by step, using simple language and clear diagrams, connecting the abstract world of the paradox to the concrete world of shapes and forces. It was a work of art, a declaration of a different way of thinking. When she was done, she stacked the 5 neat pages on her desk. The sun was now fully risen, casting a warm glow over her small room. She looked at her solution, not with arrogance, but with a quiet, profound sense of satisfaction. He had told her not to waste her time. She had a feeling that her time had just been spent in the most productive way possible. The walk to the lecture hall the next day was different. The world seemed sharper, more in focus. The gray concrete of the buildings, the green of the manicured lawns, the faces of the students hurrying to class, it all felt more real, more vibrant. Anjali felt like she was walking around with a secret, a warm, glowing coal tucked away in her backpack. The 5 pages, neatly stapled in the top left corner, felt both incredibly heavy and surprisingly light. She was running on fumes, having only managed a few hours of restless sleep, but her mind was humming with a quiet, steady energy. She wasn't nervous about the lecture anymore. She was just an observer, waiting for the main event. The lecture itself was a blur. Dr. Davies was back to his usual self, discussing Stokes' theorem with his characteristic blend of brilliance and arrogance. Anjali took her notes, but her heart wasn't in it. Her focus was on the thick stack of paper in her bag. She kept replaying the moment of discovery in her mind, the way the complex shapes had suddenly unfolded into a simple, beautiful flower. She wasn't looking for validation from him anymore, but she knew she had to show him. It wasn't about getting a better grade or earning his approval. It was about truth. She had found a truth, and it was a truth he had said was impossible for someone like her to find. He needed to see it. As the final minutes of the lecture ticked by, her calm started to fray. A familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Her palms grew sweaty. What if he just laughed? What if he took one look and dismissed it without a second thought? What if he found some tiny flaw, some technicality that invalidated the whole thing? The old doubts, the ones she thought she had conquered, began to whisper in her ear. You're just a mechanic. He's a mathematician. Who do you think you are? The bell rang, its shrill sound jolting her from her thoughts. The students around her began to pack up, the sudden noise of zippers and rustling papers filling the hall. Anjali didn't move. She watched as Dr. Davies packed his briefcase, his movements efficient and detached, as if he couldn't wait to escape the room full of inferior minds. This was her chance. If she let him walk out that door, she might never get the courage again. Taking a deep breath that felt more like a gasp, she slung her backpack over her shoulder and walked down the aisle. Her legs felt stiff, robotic. The other students streamed past her, their chatter about lunch plans and weekend parties fading into the background. Soon it was just her and him in the vast, emptying room. He was zipping up his briefcase, his back to her. "Professor," she said. Her voice came out as a squeak, barely audible. He didn't turn around. "If it's a question, the answer is in the textbook," he said, his voice muffled and impatient. "It's not a question," she said. A little louder this time. He finally turned and his face was a mask of annoyance. He looked at his watch. "I have a meeting in 5 minutes." This was it. The moment of truth. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure he could see it. She walked the last few steps to his lectern and pulled the 5 pages from her backpack. Her hand was trembling slightly as she held them out. "I think I found a different way to solve the problem you mentioned. The Kovalevsky paradox." He stared at the pages in her hand as if they were something unpleasant he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. He let out a small, weary sigh, the sound of a man deeply burdened by the foolishness of others. He was ready to shoo her away, to deliver a final, crushing remark that would send her scurrying. But then something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, not the scared, hopeful look from the first day, but a calm, steady gaze. Maybe it was just pure, morbid curiosity. He reached out and took the papers. "An undergraduate's attempt at a Fields Medal problem," he muttered, not looking at her. He intended to give them a 10-second glance, find a basic error, and hand them back with a withering comment. He looked at the first page. His eyes scanned the title, written in her neat block letters. Then they moved to the first diagram. It was a simple drawing of a cube, unfolded into a cross shape. He frowned. This was not the standard approach. He was expecting to see a mess of sigma notation and tensor calculus. He flipped to the second page. His eyes narrowed. He saw how she had used concepts from basic stress analysis to map the vectors onto the surface of the cube. It was unorthodox. It was completely wrong, it had to be, but it was intriguing. He sat down slowly in the chair behind the lectern. The briefcase lay forgotten at his feet. He pulled a pen from his jacket pocket. Anjali stood there, silent, watching him. She saw the change happen. It was subtle at first, then undeniable. The condescending professor disappeared. In his place was a scholar, a man who had stumbled upon a truly fascinating puzzle. He leaned forward, his entire body focused on the pages. He started scribbling furiously in the margins, muttering to himself under his breath. "No, that can't work. But if you consider the sheer stress here, my God, you're reframing the entire metric space." Minutes passed. The room was completely silent except for the scratching of his pen on the paper and his quiet, frantic muttering. He flipped back and forth between the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was no longer grading her work. He was wrestling with it. He was trying to find the flaw, the weak link in her logic, but he couldn't. Every step, every diagram was perfect. It was a house of cards built on a foundation of solid granite. Finally, he stopped. He put the pen down and leaned back in his chair, the stack of pages held loosely in one hand. He just stared at them, his expression one of pure, unadulterated shock. It was the look of a man who had just discovered the world was not flat, after all. He slowly lifted his head and looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw not a student, not a girl from the wrong side of town, not a persistent but untalented learner. He saw a mind. A brilliant, revolutionary mind. "This," he began, his voice hoarse, uncertain. He cleared his throat and tried again. "This is brilliant." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. "The approach is, it's entirely novel. No one has ever thought to apply solid mechanics principles to a topological problem like this. It's elegant in its simplicity." He looked from the pages back to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How? Where did you get this idea?" Anjali felt a wave of something so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. It wasn't pride. It wasn't victory. It was validation. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time. All the late nights, all the self-doubt, all the humiliation, it all melted away in that single moment. She had not just solved a math problem. She had dismantled his entire, carefully constructed worldview with nothing more than a pencil and a different way of seeing. She stood there, tall and straight, and met his gaze. The power in the room had shifted completely, and they both knew it. The silence in the empty lecture hall was heavier than any sound. Anjali stood there, her heart no longer pounding with fear, but with a slow, steady rhythm of triumph. Dr. Davies was still looking at her. His face a canvas of emotions she had never seen on it before: shock, awe, and something else, something that looked a lot like humility. He repeated his question, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "How? Where did you get this idea?" Anjali took a small breath. She thought about all the hours she had spent feeling small, feeling like an imposter. She thought about her dad with his grease-stained hands and his practical genius. The answer felt simple, because it was. "I didn't think about it like a mathematician," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I thought about it like a mechanic. You see a problem, you don't start by writing a poem about it. You take it apart. You look at the pieces. I just drew it over and over until I saw how the pieces were supposed to fit together. It wasn't about the symbols. It was about the shape." Dr. Davies just stared at her, her simple explanation clearly hitting him with more force than any complex theorem could. "A mechanic," he murmured, looking down at the pages in his hand as if they were a sacred text. "Of course. We all try to find the key, but you built a new door." He stood up, and for the first time he seemed to notice the empty room, the passage of time. His forgotten meeting was a distant, irrelevant memory. "Anjali," he said, and the sound of his voice saying her name, not as a reprimand but with respect, felt strange and new. "What you have here. This isn't just a clever solution to a classroom problem. This is publishable. This is something the entire mathematical community needs to see." He started pacing, his old energy returning, but it was different now. It wasn't arrogant. It was fired by a passionate academic excitement. "I have colleagues who have spent their careers on problems like this. We need to verify it, of course, we need to formalize the language, but the core idea, it's solid." He stopped in front of her, and the old power dynamic was gone, replaced by something else entirely. "I cannot let you walk out of this room and go back to being just another student in my class. That would be an academic crime. I want you to work with me. As my research assistant, we can clean this up, write the paper, and get it submitted. This is your discovery, and you will be the lead author." The offer hung in the air, so immense it was almost hard to grasp. A research assistant position, something usually reserved for graduate students, a direct path into the world of academic research. It was everything she had secretly dreamed of, and it was being offered by the one person she thought would never see her worth. She felt a surge of emotion so powerful it took her breath away. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, a single word that felt like the beginning of a whole new life. The news, as expected, spread like wildfire. Dr. Davies, true to his word, moved with an urgency that was breathtaking. He didn't just show her solution to a colleague. He called an emergency meeting of the graduate-level mathematics seminar. Anjali, who had spent weeks feeling invisible, was suddenly the center of attention. She stood at the front of a small room, with Dr. Davies by her side, and explained her method to a group of people who had forgotten more about math than she would ever learn. They were skeptical at first, their expressions questioning. But as she spoke, and as Dr. Davies chimed in with formal translations of her intuitive leaps, the skepticism turned to murmurs of disbelief, then to nods of profound respect. That evening, back in her dorm room, she finally felt the weight of it all. She called her parents. Her mom answered, the sound of a busy hospital in the background. "Anjali, is everything okay? Are you sick?" "No, Mom, everything's great," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "I have something to tell you." She tried to explain what had happened, leaving out the complex math and focusing on the important part. "My professor, he saw my work and he was really impressed. He's offering me a chance to do research with him. It's a really big deal." There was a pause on the other end of the line. She could hear her mom call her dad to the phone. Anjali, what is this about? Her dad's voice boomed, warm and familiar. She told him again, trying to make it sound simple. Dad, I solved a really hard problem. The kind he said no one solves, and now he wants my help. She heard him let out a long, slow whistle. Well, I'll be, he said, his voice thick with a pride that needed no further explanation. That's my girl. You show how a mechanic's daughter fixes things. They didn't understand the Kovalevsky paradox, but they understood their daughter had been seen. They understood she had won. That was all that mattered. The next Calculus 3 lecture was the most surreal experience of her life. Anjali sat in her usual seat, but everything was different. The other students looked at her differently, with a mixture of awe and curiosity. The whispers followed her down the aisle. But the biggest change was at the front of the room. Dr. Davies walked in, and he was the same man, but he wasn't. The arrogant smirk was gone. The condescending tone had vanished. He began his lecture, but about halfway through he paused. Last week, he said, his voice clear and strong, I presented a problem and dismissed it as an intellectual curiosity beyond the scope of this course. I was wrong. A quiet gasp went through the lecture hall. Dr. Davies did not admit error. It was a failure of imagination on my part. I assumed there was only one path to a solution, the traditional, abstract path. I failed to consider that brilliance can come from anywhere, from any perspective. Sometimes the most elegant solution is not the most complex one, but the one that sees the problem with fresh eyes. He didn't look directly at her, but Anjali knew he was talking to her and about her. He spent the rest of the lecture encouraging creative thinking, praising students who asked silly questions and dismantling the very philosophy of elitism he had built his class on. He was a changed man, and his change was changing everyone around him. A few weeks later, Anjali was sitting in Dr. Davies's office. It was a small, cluttered space, filled with books that smelled like wisdom and time. They were working on her paper, two heads bent over a draft, a pot of cold coffee between them. He wasn't her professor anymore. He was her colleague. He challenged her, pushed her, and respected her in equal measure. She had officially added a pure mathematics major to her engineering degree. Her academic path now a thrilling open road. That one calculus problem hadn't just solved an equation. It had dismantled a barrier, not just for her, but for the quiet, underestimated students who would come after her. It had taught a brilliant but prejudiced professor that genius wasn't a gift for a select few, but a spark that could be found in the most unexpected of places. And for Anjali, it had done something even more important. It had taught her that the way she saw the world, with her practical mechanics hands and her determined heart, wasn't a weakness. It was her greatest strength.